I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us online for Henley and Partners' 16th Annual Global Citizenship Conference. My name's Juliet Foster, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists for this next session, which is focused on the Andan global city, a thriving metropolis for refugees. Well, joining me online is Dr. Christian H. Kaelin. He's the chairman of Henley and Partners and also the founder and chairman of the Andan Foundation. Our other panelists include Professor Khalid Koser, who's the executive director of the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, and Dr. Titus Gebel, who's the founder and president of the Free Cities Foundation. Both Professor Koser and Dr. Gebel are also members of the governing board of the Andan Foundation. So gentlemen, welcome. Christian Kaelin, let me start with you first. When we look at the 21st century, it's fair to say that it's witnessed a major global refugee crisis. And in that context, Andan Global City Project is your response. So how is it going to work? And from your perspective, what makes it a game changer?
The issues we are going to face, and we are facing even already now with migration, with forced migration, are really staggering. So we will have actually a lot more of that, not least through climate change and more volatility in the world. So there is a lot more to come. And what we plan with this Andan Global City concept is actually a part of what we think is part of the solution, but it's a part of, I mean, of course, you know, the main focus must remain to see that in countries where currently or in the future conditions become unlivable, we need to find remedies in these countries as much as possible to make, you know, livable conditions again in these countries. But there are situations, and increasingly so, that people cannot live anymore where they are now. So they need to go somewhere else. Where do they go? And you see, in the past, you could actually move much more easily. You know, you could go to America, for example. This is one example that I think plays very well here, because the US used to, for a long time, be very open to new migrants. You could basically, if you were healthy and you could afford or get somehow a ticket to America, you could go there and arrive with nothing and build a new life. And here is really the point. You see, like today, it is very hard for people to move to countries and build a new life. There are places like Canada that take a certain number of migrants actively and have a very good migration policy that actually makes sense for the migrants and for the host country. But in most cases, if you look at Europe, it's a disaster. So basically, you have hundreds of thousands of people arriving in Europe without policy, without a plan, a lot of it undocumented. There's no strategy. People are moved around. They're often not allowed to work. They're miserable. And instead of contributing and being able to contribute to society, they're a burden and also are viewed as a burden. Now, what we are saying is actually, if someone has to leave their home, no one leaves their home out of just fanciness. You know, they have to go. They have to go somewhere else. And if you have to burn your bridges behind you, if they're being burned, you know, you basically are very motivated to put down roots and build a new life. And this can unleash a lot of you know, human potential. And rather than seeing migrants as a problem, we see them as potentials. And what we would like to build is at least initially one place where people can thrive, rather than being a burden and are mostly amongst themselves, but also other people that wish to move to such a new, what we call global city, that is welcoming and has its own immigration system for migrants from all over the world. And that is just part of a solution that we think is necessary going forward, because we will, you know, very soon have hundreds of millions of people on the move.
And Christian, you're on the record as citing America as an example of how an open immigration policy can work successfully. So does Andan incorporate elements of that policy? And do you not find it ironic that the United States' success has been built on immigrant labor, and yet we've heard governments recently doubling down on immigration with their rhetoric?
Yeah, it is interesting. You know, if you look at the United States history, I mean, if you, for the moment, put aside, you know, the extinction almost of the native population, or the significant reduction in population of Native Americans and their removal of the native land. If you leave that aside, United States was largely basically built by immigrants, by refugees, by people who in other parts of the world had to leave because of famine, war, religious persecution, or other reasons. So the United States, no doubt, is a big success story, and actually so are many other countries. If you look at Central South America, Australia, New Zealand, the many countries that were basically built by refugees that came from elsewhere. And so if you look at that, it's definitely a success. But now you have the situation that the world evolved, and you have wealthy countries and countries that have become wealthy over time, like the United States, that are very restrictive now to certain types of immigrants. Still, even with this rhetoric and what you mentioned, the US is still one of the more open countries in the world. If you look at other parts of the world, it is very different. So the US, Canada, and these countries still have retained this immigration spirit. We look at them as they're still immigration countries. Their whole policies, their way, their immigration system is set up is geared towards immigration. And the US is still one of the countries that are one of the most flexible. And therefore also, I think, very successful with that, because I think the more flexible you are with the immigration policy, the better it is for the country.
Khalid, Koser, governments often respond to refugee crises by building camps that are meant to be temporary. But why is it that these temporary settlements end up becoming permanent? And how does that reality impact not just on the life chances of refugees, but also their lifespans?
Well, thanks for the question. Look, I think part of the answer is that we are stuck in a cycle with refugees where more and more refugees are arriving, but we're finding fewer and fewer solutions for them. The UN Refugee Agency estimates that 37,000 people each day are leaving their homes, some to cross borders, some to stay inside their countries. That's something like 25 people per minute every year. Now, for a host country, putting these people in camps is a sensible thing to do. Camps are an effective place to deliver humanitarian aid, to assist people, to keep people safe. A cynic might say camps are also a way to remove liberty and freedom from people, but I think on balance, I would say that camps are a positive thing to do, but only in the short term. If you keep people in a camp for a year and then find a solution for them, I think that's a reasonable thing to do. What we have increasingly in the world today is refugees and their children basically spending their entire lives in camps. We've run out of solutions. Refugees are not going home because conflicts are not being resolved. Very few countries allow refugees to settle permanently locally by giving them citizenship. And there's a few very good countries, Canada, a few of the Nordic countries, Australia, New Zealand, that do resettle a few people, but certainly not enough people. So we're in a situation where we have more and more people arriving, fewer and fewer solutions. Camps are the sensible response, but they are lasting for too long. And what that means is that people are facing all sorts of challenges. They are being deprived of using their skills to work. We have high rates of domestic violence, high rates of suicide, high rates of drug abuse. And that's just within camps. Outside the camps, I think increasing resentment. It's one thing hosting a refugee population for a year or two and understanding these people are in desperate need. But when your taxes are going to support people for 20 or 30 years, you can understand that some people become quite frustrated about that. So we clearly need new solutions. Camps are not working.
Titus, Gebel, how could Andan Global City be successfully integrated into a host community? And above all, how do you ensure that in attracting new investments, nearby cities don't feel as if they're losing out on all the potential investment benefits?
It is of utmost importance that a win-win situation is created between the Andan Global City and the host nation. Otherwise, it will not work. So no forced solutions. But I think there can be a lot of things brought to the table by creating, especially if this city is created in an area that was formerly uninhabited or sparsely populated. Because then you can point at saying, look, there was desert before, and now there's a city with 60, 70,000 industrious people working there, all coming from the outside. And suddenly, not only wealth for the city is created, but of course it has a lot of influence and effect on the outside. There are more investments done, there are services asked for from the surrounding cities, and there are a lot of elements that bring more demand also for the producers in the surrounding area. And let me give you an example from history. In the Middle Ages, when these free imperial cities were popping up in Central Europe, in Italy, first the monarchs were fighting against them because of their independence or semi-autonomy. But after several decades, this completely turned around. Now the monarchs were offering space and territory for creating new free cities because they saw that these cities were helping creating wealth in the whole country. These were the secondary effects, that if you create an economic hub, then the whole surrounding area also has a better situation. And I think this is something we can point to historic examples that will create this win-win situation, which will it not make only acceptable to the host nation, but even desirable.
So just in reply to Titus, I think it's very interesting what he said, but it's important to note also that, you know, the Andan Global City it's not the idea to build a better refugee camp that is maybe with better facilities and so on. There are many groups and plans and so on that attempt to do exactly that. We attempt to do something very different. We attempt to build, and this is why we're very close to the free cities concept. We built a free city for mainly migrants that have to go away from somewhere, but also for other people. It should be a place that is so attractive that maybe you and I think about going there and live there for 5 years because it's a really interesting and happening place. And it is well managed along the lines like these free city concepts are, because this is what we think also very important. If you see like the administration, how this is done today around the world, and there are many studies also that show that it's quite clear that you need to privatize a lot of the public services, but it's very difficult to do that in an existing system. And that is why it's needed to do that in a new city, in a greenfield setup where you can create a new, completely clean administration that is much more efficient than in existing ones. So that's where these free cities and Andan Global City are very close. In fact, it could maybe even be together at some point, because it's very, very similar in concept. It's just that we have primarily the humanitarian angle, and we're looking at mainly having a haven for refugees that really need to go somewhere and put down roots and start a new life. Whereas the free city per se could be mainly for other people. But actually, if you look at it, both want to be attractive places for people to live and be free and to basically unleash a human potential.
What are the benefits to Andan City investors? And above all, how would this be sustainable? Do you think that perhaps the environmental pluses are an added draw for potential investors?
Yeah, I think the investment case for this is actually very clear. So I don't think this is a problem, and we have had many discussions already with substantial private investors and also some government-related, like from sovereign wealth funds. But what is more challenging, I think the key challenge is the discussion with potential host countries to allow the real far-reaching self-governing status of such a place, because we have worldwide quite a lot of free zones and similar arrangements, actually hundreds of them worldwide. Most of them are not successful. Here we have something very different. So we are asking something that is difficult to give for a country. But like Titus said, that I think over time countries will realize, like in the past, the monarchs, it actually makes a lot of sense, to give status to new cities. The investment side, what you asked, is not a problem. Besides, there is the overall pioneering and social element, certainly in the first phase. So, as you know, this is a primarily humanitarian project. It's not really a business proposal. It's a humanitarian aspect here that is in the forefront, but it's actually also a good investment.
Andan City is a vast project and one that predictably has generated tremendous interest. But you do have to ask yourself whether the world is genuinely ready for it, given the largely negative perception surrounding refugees, and also the cynicism of politicians who might be loath to give up valuable land for some of the world's most vulnerable people.
I, of course, share your nervousness about the proposed solution that Andan is putting forward, which is to develop a brand new, fresh city for refugees around the world to come together, hopefully to work together and to generate a new society, a new culture even. I think I turn the question on its head a little bit. I think politicians are desperate for solutions. I think everybody recognizes that camps are no longer an appropriate response to the refugee crisis, and people are crying out for a new, innovative solution. And as we've seen in other spheres of public policy, it just takes someone with a vision to persuade people that there is a solution and to get people behind that vision. And then things slowly, and I think quite effectively, can fall into place with the right stakeholders, with the private sector, with governments and so on. So I think there's a general consensus around the world. We need a better solution. And I think anyone coming up with a reasonable solution would be welcome. That's part of the answer. The other part, you're clearly right. We are asking governments to set aside land, to take, to an extent, a risk, to allow a new city to be built, and within that city to bring together refugees, perhaps internally displaced persons, perhaps some migrants as well, to begin to generate a new, and we hope, exciting environment. I mean, I suppose my response to that would be twofold. Firstly, don't forget that refugee camps themselves take up a lot of space. I'm sure that the number of refugee camps around the world in terms of their area is easily equivalent to a large city. So to an extent, what you're doing is focusing and concentrating a city that's already effectively in existence across a whole series of countries. I think you would be able to sell this to whichever government might consider hosting this by pointing out that many of the great countries in the world today, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, Canada, the United States, have been built on migration. And this is simply an advancement of that idea. This is not asking societies to do something that should be alien to them. I think some European countries might find it difficult, but I think in some of these countries that recognize that they are built on migration, you'd be pushing out a bit of an open door. Now, clearly there's a lot of work to be done. You need to get governments involved. You need to make sure that local authorities understand. You need to select refugees and migrants. That in itself is a challenge. This is not a project that's going to occur next year. But I think Andan has the vision, and I think Andan and its staff have the capacity and the relations to allow this to begin. And I'm fairly convinced that once the process begins and once people understand the vision, that we'll get a lot of movement behind it. I'm quite optimistic.
Titus Gebel, could Andan City be a blueprint for the free private cities that you're known to favour? And within that context, how should they be defined? And more to the point, how would the state benefit from the predicted economic boom?
Yes, I think it can be a blueprint because many of the elements that I have developed in the free private city concept, they are given here and they can be used for the benefit of the Andan global city, especially the private governance element, which secures that there's no political struggle, no cronyism, no special interest groups, but is a service provider instead. And it's a totally international team with global best practices. So there's no colonialism issues or something like that. And that is, I think, especially important given that you have refugees then probably from all over the world, where there is a tendency that there's maybe stick together with their groups, vote their parties, and the party who that promises the most, they get elected, and then you have all this struggle. I think this should be avoided at least in the first years, so that the city can be built. And insofar, the idea to have a private governance as a service model, as in the free private city model, can be deployed here in the Andan city, Andan global city, very well. The second part of your question, how could the state profit from that, the host nation? Well, one of the things is that this city, be it a free private city or be it the Andan global city, will not be fully independent or sovereign. It will be very probably part of under the sovereignty of the host nation when it comes to defense and foreign policy, a little bit like a special administrative region, like Hong Kong and Macau have been. And maybe to avoid what happened in Hong Kong, you have some local or international states as signatory powers guaranteeing the status of this refugee city. But I think there is a lot of in it for the host nation. For example, in exchange for getting the sovereign protection and the reuse of some of the infrastructure of the host nation, the city could make a certain payment per year. Or the host nation could get a share in the city, which is, as Chris pointed out, it's an investment case, it's a private entity. So the state itself could hold a certain percentage. So if the city increases in value, the host nation also has a benefit. But I think that the biggest benefits will be secondary effects from more jobs, more investment, more economic activity is created. And insofar, I think if this is understood, and I have really hopes that some governments will understand that there is a chance that this will become a blueprint for more free cities all over the world, to create a new kind of market of living together, starting with refugees and then spreading basically for all kinds of interested persons and people who just searching for a better life or more freedom, or whatever.
And Christian Kaelin, I'd like to put the final question to you, because there are many arguments that work in Andan's favour, but do you also accept the possibility that it might never get built? And if that were to happen, how would you personally feel?
Totally. I mean, I'm completely aware and very realistic that it's a very tall order, particularly the kind of autonomy that we are looking for this city. So, you know, there are a couple of projects around the world in terms of like private cities of some sort, or independent zones, free zones, self-regulated areas, but we are asking for something very different. We are asking for a large scale autonomy, almost an own country in the country, because for this to function properly, we need to look at a model like in Hong Kong, where Hong Kong is part of China, but it's largely independent. It has its own immigration system, its own tax system, its own government, its own almost everything, you know. So if you have a residence permit in Hong Kong, it doesn't give you any right in China, and vice versa. So to do that, it is very hard. So I'm under no illusion that to achieve that would be really good, and I'm completely aware that it could fail or rather never be built. For me, that's not a failure at all. I think alone that we discuss that and look at that and aim that is important. And I always say that, you know, if you don't attempt to do it, for sure it will never be built. So you have to try.
Thank you to all of you for your time and, of course, valuable contribution to this session of Henley and Partners' 16th Annual Global Citizenship Conference, in what has been an interesting and thought-provoking discussion. And a big thank you also to our global online audience. We appreciate your interest and engagement.